He was the most feared man in London, a duke with a heart of ice who solved every problem with his vast wealth. She was the desperate daughter of a ruined lord, traded away for £40,000 to settle a debt. Arthur Blackwood expected a quiet, invisible wife to manage his household. Clara Ashford expected a cold, ruthless monster. Neither of them knew that in this calculated transaction, the true cost wouldn't be gold. It would be the absolute surrender of a duke's heavily guarded soul. 3 months earlier, the air in Arthur's London study smelled of ink, old leather, and a desperate man's sweat. Lord Ashford's hand trembled as he reached for the heavy brass pen. "You must understand, Your Grace. I had no other choice. The shipping investments failed overnight. I was trying to secure my daughter's future." "Spare me the excuses, Ashford," Arthur interrupted. His voice was a low, flat drawl that routinely made grown men flinch in boardrooms. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a single silver ring against the mahogany desk. The rhythmic sound echoed in the silent room like a countdown. "I do not care about your failed ships or your reckless gambling. I care only about the signature at the bottom of that page." Clara stood rigidly by the towering bookcase, her spine perfectly straight. She wore a simple, faded blue dress that brought out the startling clarity of her eyes, though right now, those eyes were storm clouds of quiet fury. She refused to look at her father. She kept her gaze fixed entirely on the Duke of Kincaid, the man who had just purchased her life for £40,000. Arthur finally turned his cold gray eyes toward her. He felt absolutely nothing. She was lovely, certainly, golden hair that caught the dim library light, porcelain skin, a delicate jaw. But beauty was merely a commodity in his world, and Arthur had enough wealth to buy whatever he pleased. He needed a wife to manage his sprawling household and serve as a respectable, stabilizing mother figure for his orphaned niece, Lily. A business arrangement was far safer than the messy, unpredictable nature of a love match. "Miss Ashford," Arthur said, his tone completely devoid of warmth, "let us be clear from the very start. I am a man who values order, quiet, and efficiency. You are here to fulfill a duty." Clara's hands tightened into fists at her sides, her fingernails biting into her palms, but her voice was surprisingly steady. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace. I am a ledger entry, a transaction to balance my father's accounts." Arthur's brow twitched. He wasn't used to women speaking back to him, especially not women whose fate rested entirely in his hands. "You will be my wife," he corrected smoothly, his voice dropping a fraction. "A title that comes with every luxury, every gown, and every privilege you could ever desire. Your father's debts are wiped clean. Your family's ruin is averted. In exchange, I expect total compliance." "Compliance," she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Will you require me to fade into the wallpaper as well, or am I allowed to breathe without a written schedule?" Lord Ashford gasped, his face turning pale. "Clara, apologize at once to His Grace." Arthur held up a hand, silencing the older man instantly without even looking at him. He stood up, uncoiling his tall, imposing frame from behind the desk. He walked slowly toward Clara. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with every step he took. When he stopped, he was entirely too close. He smelled of rain and sandalwood, an intoxicating mix that confused her senses, but his eyes were like winter ice. "You may breathe however you wish, Miss Ashford," Arthur murmured, looking down at her. "But do not mistake this financial arrangement for a romantic pursuit. I do not have a heart to give you. I certainly do not want yours. We will live separate, peaceful, highly structured lives. Do we have an agreement?" Clara looked up into his face. He was devastatingly handsome, with a sharp, unforgiving jawline and dark hair, but there was a terrifying emptiness in him. He wasn't a man, he was a fortress. "We have a transaction, Your Grace," Clara said quietly, refusing to break eye contact or take a step back. "I will be the mother your niece so desperately needs. I will run your home flawlessly. But do not worry about my heart. It was never part of the bargain." Arthur stared at her for a long moment. Something unfamiliar and tight shifted in his chest at her fierce defiance. He pushed the feeling down immediately. locking it away where it belonged. "Excellent," he said, turning sharply away from her. He walked back to the desk, picked up the signed contract, folded it meticulously, and slid it into his drawer. The heavy click of the lock sounded exactly like a prison door sliding shut. "Pack whatever meager things you wish to keep. We leave for Kincaid Manor in an hour." The carriage wheels crunched against the gravel driveway, breaking the long, suffocating silence that had stretched between them for miles. Clara peered out the window. Kincaid Manor rose from the mist like a jagged stone fortress. It was vast, gray, and entirely devoid of life. There were no flowers near the entryway, no warm lights spilling from the tall windows. It looked exactly like its master. Arthur opened the carriage door before the footman could reach it. He stepped out into the crisp evening air and offered her a gloved hand. It was a perfectly polite gesture, yet completely mechanical. Clara placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but brief, dropping her fingers the second her boots touched the ground. "Welcome to your new place of employment, Miss Ashford," Arthur said dryly. He didn't wait for a response, turning and striding up the massive stone steps. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and followed him inside. The grand foyer was cavernous and drafty. A line of servants stood at strict attention against the wood-paneled wall. None of them dared to make eye contact with the Duke. They looked less like a household staff and more like soldiers awaiting a military inspection. "This is Mrs. Hess, the housekeeper," Arthur said, gesturing vaguely to a stiff-backed woman in black. "She will show you to your chambers. Dinner is served precisely at 8 o'clock. I do not tolerate tardiness." "I assure you, Your Grace, I can read a clock," Clara replied smoothly. A few of the maids inhaled sharply. Mrs. Hess's eyes widened. Arthur merely paused on the stairs, his jaw tightening, but he didn't look back. "Where is Lily?" Arthur asked the housekeeper, his voice echoing in the large hall. "In the nursery, Your Grace," Mrs. Hess answered, her voice trembling slightly. "She has been difficult today. She refuses to eat." Arthur sighed, a harsh sound of annoyance and helplessness. "I will speak with her." "Allow me," Clara said, stepping forward. Arthur finally turned to look at her. "You are tired from the journey. Mrs. Hess can handle the child until tomorrow." "I am not tired. I am her new aunt," Clara said, her voice dropping its defensive edge and softening into something fiercely protective. "And a frightened child does not need to wait until tomorrow for comfort." Arthur stared at her, assessing her like a puzzle he didn't quite have the pieces for. "Very well, follow me." They climbed 2 flights of wide, sweeping stairs. The upper corridors were just as dark and lifeless as the foyer. Finally, Arthur stopped before a heavy oak door. He pushed it open, but he did not step inside. He stood at the threshold, an imposing shadow filling the frame. Clara stepped past him into the nursery. It was a large room, filled with expensive toys, perfectly arranged and completely untouched. In the far corner, huddled beneath a massive window seat, was a tiny girl. Lily was 5 years old, wearing a stiff black morning dress that swallowed her small frame. Her knees were pulled to her chest, and she was crying softly. Arthur cleared his throat. "Lily, come here." The little girl flinched at his deep, commanding voice and pressed herself tighter against the wall. Clara felt a sharp ache in her chest. She ignored Arthur completely. She didn't walk gracefully across the room. She dropped directly to her knees on the cold floor and crawled a few paces forward, putting herself at the little girl's eye level without towering over her. "Hello, Lily," Clara whispered. Her voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the echoing cold of the manor. "My name is Clara." Lily peeked out from behind her arms. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Are you the new governess? Uncle Arthur said he was buying me a new mother." Arthur shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. Clara shot him a quick, sharp glare over her shoulder before turning her warm smile back to the child. "He isn't very good with words, is he?" Clara said softly. Lily hesitated, then gave a tiny shake of her head. "I'm not a governess," Clara continued, moving just a fraction closer, "and I cannot replace your mother, but I do know some excellent stories, and I was told this house is very big, and I might need a brave guide to show me the best hiding spots. Do you think you could help me?" Lily sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her sleeve. "I know a secret passage behind the library." "A secret passage?" Clara gasped in mock wonder. "Well, that settles it. We are going to be great friends." She offered her hand, palm up, waiting patiently. Slowly, cautiously, Lily uncurled from her corner. She reached out and placed her tiny hand in Clara's. Clara didn't pull her. She simply held the child's hand securely, offering a silent promise of safety. From the doorway, Arthur watched the exchange in total silence. He had expected the Ashford girl to manage the child, yes, but he had not expected this immediate, effortless warmth. It made the cold in his own chest feel suddenly, acutely painful. He turned away before Clara could see his expression, his heavy footsteps retreating down the dark hall. The transaction was complete, but as he walked away, the Duke of Kincaid felt an unsettling certainty that he had just lost control of his own house. The next morning, Kincaid Manor was as silent as a tomb. Clara stood in the center of her massive, unfamiliar bedchamber and stared at the heavy, forest-green velvet drapes blocking the windows. The room was suffocating. It smelled of stale lavender and old money. With a determined breath, Clara marched across the thick Persian rug and seized the velvet fabric. She pulled with all her weight. The curtains slid back with a loud, metallic screech. Morning sunlight shattered the gloom, pouring across the dark mahogany floors in brilliant golden pools. Clara closed her eyes, letting the warmth wash over her face. This was her first battle. She would not let this house swallow her alive. Downstairs, the breakfast room was just as dreary. A long, intimidating dining table stretched across the room, set with exquisite silver and bone china. A young maid was quietly stoking the fireplace, jumping nervously when Clara entered. "Good morning," Clara said cheerfully. The maid dropped a hasty curtsy, her eyes wide. "Good morning, Your Grace. I am Mary. Shall I serve your tea? His Grace has already departed for his study." "Yes, Mary, thank you. But first, let us have some light." Clara moved to the tall windows and threw open the heavy drapes, just as she had done in her chamber. Mary gasped softly. "Oh, Your Grace, Mr. Sterling says the Duke prefers the house kept dim, to preserve the tapestries." Clara turned, offering the terrified girl a gentle smile. "Tapestries can be replaced, Mary. People cannot. A house without sunlight is just a very expensive cave." Before Mary could reply, the door creaked open. Little Lily shuffled in, still wearing a severe, dark dress that made her look like a tiny ghost. She clutched a worn rag doll against her chest and stared at the massive table with dread. Clara knew that under Arthur's regime, the child was expected to sit silently at the far end, eating her porridge without making a sound. Clara didn't sit at the head of the table. Instead, she pulled out a heavy oak chair right next to Lily's assigned spot and sat down. "Good morning, Lily," Clara said, pouring a generous amount of honey into a small bowl of oatmeal. "Did you know that in my father's house, we had a cook who believed porridge was actually a sleeping potion used by dragons?" Lily's eyes widened. She slowly climbed into her chair. "Dragons?" "Absolutely," Clara whispered conspiratorially. "They want us to eat it so we fall asleep, and then they can steal all our shiny spoons. So, to defeat the dragon, you must eat it very fast and stay wide awake." Lily stared at her bowl, then at Clara. A tiny, fragile giggle escaped her lips. She picked up her silver spoon and took a bite. "I am awake," she announced. "A brave night indeed," Clara beamed, taking a sip of her tea. The heavy oak door swung open again. Mr. Sterling, the imposing, gray-haired butler, stepped into the room. He held a silver pocket watch in one hand and a stiff piece of parchment in the other. He stopped dead in his tracks, blinking at the bright sunlight flooding the room and the sight of the Duchess sitting side by side with the child. "Your Grace," Sterling said, his voice stiff. "It is precisely 9 o'clock. The Duke's schedule dictates that Miss Lily must now proceed to the library for her French recitations, followed by an hour of silent reading." Clara didn't flinch. She gently wiped a drop of honey from Lily's chin with a napkin, then turned her clear blue eyes to the butler. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Clara said evenly. "However, the schedule has changed." Sterling frowned, holding up the parchment. "His Grace wrote this schedule himself. And His Grace entrusted the care of this child and the management of this household to me," Clara replied. Her tone was perfectly polite, yet completely immovable. "Today, Lily and I will be studying botany, outside, in the dirt." Lily gasped in delight. Sterling looked as though he might faint. "In the dirt, Your Grace?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Please inform the kitchen we will require a picnic basket in an hour." Clara stood up, offering her hand to Lily. The little girl took it immediately, her tiny fingers wrapping warmly around Clara's. As Clara walked out of the breakfast room, leading the skipping child toward the gardens, she could feel the shocked stares of the servants on her back. The transaction she made with the Duke was supposed to buy her obedience. But Arthur Blackwood was about to learn that he hadn't bought a silent ghost to haunt his halls. He had bought a storm, and the weather in Kincaid Manor was finally changing. Arthur Blackwood demanded absolute silence when he worked. The heavy oak doors of his study were designed to keep the world out, and for 10 years they had done exactly that. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his silver pen scratching methodically across a ledger. Numbers made sense. Columns added up. Debts were paid. But today, the silence was broken. A sound drifted through the thick glass of the tall windows. It was high, bright, and entirely foreign to Kincaid Manor. Arthur's hand froze. He frowned, a dark crease forming between his brows. He set the pen down, the silver ringing sharply against the wood. Was someone hurt? He pushed his chair back and strode across the dark room, pulling the heavy velvet curtain aside just an inch. Down on the immaculate south lawn, absolute chaos was unfolding. Clara was not sitting gracefully on a stone bench. She was running. Her fine muslin day dress was stained with green grass at the knees, and her carefully pinned golden hair had rebelled, falling down her back in loose, wild waves. She was chasing a scruffy, mud-covered terrier. The small dog had somehow breached the manor's walls and was currently galloping across the manicured flower beds, holding Clara's straw bonnet triumphantly in its teeth. Right behind them, running as fast as her small legs could carry her, was Lily. The little girl wasn't wearing her stiff black morning gown. She wore a simple white pinafore, and she was shrieking. Arthur tensed, his hand gripping the velvet drape. But as the sound drifted up to his second-floor window, he realized Lily wasn't crying. She was laughing. It was a breathless, belly-deep giggle he hadn't heard since his brother was alive. Down in the garden, Clara suddenly dove forward. She didn't trip. She threw herself onto the soft grass, wrapping her arms around the squirming dog. They tumbled together in a heap of mud, paws, and petticoats. The dog dropped the bonnet and immediately began licking Clara's face. Instead of scolding the beast, Clara threw her head back and laughed. The sound hit Arthur right in the chest. It was rich, unrestrained, and wildly beautiful. It wasn't the polite, calculated titter of the women of the ton. It was pure joy. He watched as Lily threw herself down next to Clara, burying her face in the dog's messy fur. Clara wrapped one arm around the little girl and the other around the stray dog, pulling them both into a tight hug. The sunlight caught the golden strands of her hair, making her look like a painting brought to life. Arthur forgot to breathe. He stood at the window, a man who controlled shipping empires and ruined rivals with a single word, completely paralyzed by the sight of his wife in the mud. He felt a strange, terrifying tightness in his chest. A warmth he had spent a decade trying to freeze over was slowly thawing, spreading through his veins. Without his permission, the corner of his mouth twitched. He tried to press his lips into their usual severe line, but he couldn't. As Clara tickled Lily's sides, making the child squeal, Arthur's stern jaw relaxed. A smile, a real, genuine, unguarded smile, broke across the Duke of Kincaid's face. It changed him entirely, washing away the years of bitter isolation. For one suspended moment, he wasn't a fortress. He was just a man, hopelessly mesmerized by the light in his garden. "Your Grace," The dry, reedy voice of Mr. Sterling cut through the room like a blade. Arthur flinched. He dropped the velvet curtain instantly, spinning around as if he had been caught stealing from his own vault. The smile vanished, replaced immediately by a mask of cold, sharp stone. Sterling stood in the doorway, holding a silver tray with the afternoon post. The butler's eyes flicked to the window, then back to the Duke. "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Grace. It appears a stray animal has compromised the grounds. Shall I have the groundskeeper remove it?" Arthur walked slowly back to his desk, forcing his hands not to clench. He sat down, picking up his silver pen. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his voice was smooth and dangerously quiet. "No, Sterling." The butler blinked. "No, Your Grace? But the flower beds." "The flower beds will recover," Arthur interrupted coldly, dipping his pen in the inkwell. He didn't look up at the butler. "Have the kitchens prepare a plate of roasted meat for the dog. If Lily wishes to keep the beast, she may. Have it bathed." Sterling stared at the top of the Duke's dark head, clearly stunned. "Very good, Your Grace. And the Duchess? She is, quite soiled." Arthur's grip on the pen tightened until his knuckles turned white. He remembered the sunlight in her hair and the sound of her laugh. It took everything in his power to keep his voice steady. "The Duchess," Arthur said softly, "may do exactly as she pleases." Sterling bowed stiffly and left the room, pulling the heavy oak doors shut. Arthur was alone again. The room was perfectly silent. But as he stared at the neat columns of numbers in his ledger, the numbers blurred. He couldn't read them. He could only see her eyes. He placed a hand flat against his chest, right over his violently beating heart, realizing with terrifying clarity that his carefully ordered world was already gone. The crystal chandeliers of Lord Harrington's estate blazed with light, but the atmosphere in the grand drawing room was utterly freezing. The cream of London society had gathered for the season's most anticipated dinner, or rather, the season's most anticipated spectacle. Arthur stood near the marble fireplace, nursing a glass of amber brandy. His face was a mask of bored indifference, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. He could hear the whispers weaving through the room like venomous snakes. £40,000, they say. Her father was ruined. The Duke simply bought her like a prize mare. Poor thing. She won't last a month in Kincaid's icebox. Arthur's grip on his crystal glass tightened until the thick rim groaned. He had never cared what the The thought of him. He was the monster in the dark, the ruthless negotiator. Let them whisper. But tonight, the whispers were not about him. They were about Clara. The heavy oak doors opened, and the room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. Clara stepped into the drawing room. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that flowed around her like water. There were no diamonds dripping from her neck, only a simple pearl choker. But she didn't need jewels. She carried herself with a quiet, undeniable majesty. Arthur felt his breath catch. He had expected her to be terrified. He had expected her to shrink under the weight of 100 judging eyes, to look to him for rescue. He had even prepared to step forward and use his sheer, terrifying presence to shield her from the wolves. But Clara didn't shrink. She stood perfectly tall, her chin lifted, her striking blue eyes sweeping across the room with polite, unbothered calm. Arthur set his glass down on the mantel. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, parting the crowd like a warship cutting through a calm sea. The gossips stepped back instantly, terrified of the dark look in his eyes. He stopped in front of her, offering his arm. His voice dropped to a low, rough whisper, meant only for her. "They are vultures, Clara. You do not have to speak to them. Give the word, and we will leave." Clara looked up at him. She saw the tension in his rigid jaw, the violent protectiveness burning in his gray eyes. It wasn't coldness anymore, it was fire. Her heart gave a sudden, hard flutter. She placed her gloved hand on his forearm. Her touch was light, but it sent a shockwave straight up his arm. "I am perfectly fine, Arthur," she murmured softly. It was the first time she had used his given name. "I have survived my father's ruin. I will not drown in a teacup of society gossip. A small, amazed huff of breath escaped him. He placed his other hand over her fingers, pressing them firmly against his sleeve. Then let us face the vultures together. During dinner, Arthur found he couldn't taste a single thing on his silver plate. He was completely consumed by the woman sitting to his right. Lady Harrington, a woman with sharp features and a sharper tongue, leaned across the table. "Tell us, Your Grace," she addressed Clara with a sickly sweet smile. "How do you find Kincaid Manor? I have heard it is terribly isolated. A difficult adjustment for a young bride, used to the vibrant life of London, I imagine." The entire table stopped eating. They waited for the new Duchess to stumble, to show weakness. Arthur's eyes darkened. He shifted his weight, preparing to verbally decimate Lady Harrington. But beneath the linen tablecloth, Clara's hand found his knee. She gave a gentle, reassuring squeeze, silently telling him to stop. Arthur froze, the heat of her touch branding him right through his trousers. Clara offered Lady Harrington a serene, blinding smile. "It is peaceful, my lady. Some homes require constant noise to mask their emptiness. Kincaid Manor requires no such illusions. We find the quiet quite fulfilling." Someone down the table choked on their wine. Lady Harrington's mouth opened and closed like a stranded fish. Arthur stared at his wife, completely awestruck. She wasn't just surviving, she was conquering them, and she was doing it with a grace he had never possessed. As the guests finally looked away, sufficiently chastised, Arthur leaned in close. The scent of her jasmine perfume clouded his senses. He let his hand drop beneath the table, his long fingers finding hers. He didn't just hold her hand. He intertwined their fingers, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her knuckles in a slow, possessive rhythm. "Remind me never to negotiate against you, Duchess," he whispered against her ear, his voice thick with raw admiration. Clara shivered at the deep rumble of his voice, her cheeks flushing a delicate pink. She squeezed his hand back, completely forgetting the 100 pairs of eyes in the room. In that crowded, hostile dining hall, there was only the heat of his skin against hers, and the terrifying, wonderful realization that the Duke of Kincaid was no longer her captor. He was her shield. The after-dinner gathering in the Harrington drawing room was stifling. The gentlemen had rejoined the ladies, and the air grew thick with cigar smoke, heavy perfumes, and calculated laughter. Arthur stood close to Clara, his tall frame acting as a physical barrier between his wife and the prying eyes of the Ton. He was just beginning to think they could escape when a shadow fell across them. Lord Whitmore, a man with a thin mustache and a bitter, calculating gaze, stepped into their circle. Whitmore was a shipping magnate, or rather, he had been, until Arthur had dismantled his failing empire the previous year. "Kincaid," Whitmore drawled, swirling the brandy in his glass. His eyes slid over to Clara, gleaming with malice. "And the new Duchess. I must say, Your Grace, she is a lovely acquisition, much prettier than the merchant fleets you usually swallow up." Arthur's jaw locked, his blood turned to ice. He took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to ruin Whitmore entirely. But before Arthur could unleash the dark, destructive force he was famous for, Clara stepped forward. She didn't hide behind her husband. She moved smoothly, placing herself slightly in front of Arthur, facing the bitter lord with an utterly placid expression. "Lord Whitmore, I presume?" Clara asked, her voice light and melodic, carrying just enough volume to ensure the surrounding guests could hear. Whitmore puffed his chest out slightly. "Indeed, Your Grace." "My husband has mentioned you," Clara said, smiling pleasantly. Whitmore smirked. "Has he? No doubt boasting about his ruthless victories. The Duke is known for taking what he wants, regardless of who he destroys. A pirate in a tailored suit, some might say. One wonders if he purchased his bride with the same cold calculation he uses to steal ships." The surrounding conversation died instantly. The silence was deafening. Arthur's hands curled into fists, so tight his knuckles ached, but Clara didn't even blink. "A pirate?" Clara repeated softly, tilting her head. "How imaginative. But I am afraid you are mistaken, Lord Whitmore. A pirate steals from the defenseless." My husband merely rescues sinking ships from incompetent captains." A collective, muffled gasp rippled through the onlookers. Whitmore's smirk vanished, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. Clara took a tiny step closer to the older man, her blue eyes turning to steel. "The Duke of Kincaid does not destroy, my lord. He rebuilds what others have carelessly broken. It requires a brilliant mind and a steady hand to hold an empire together, qualities that are, sadly, not possessed by everyone." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lose her temper. She delivered the absolute devastation of Lord Whitmore with the grace of a queen executing a traitor. "Now, if you will excuse us," Clara finished smoothly, turning back to Arthur with that same serene, blinding smile. "My husband and I were just leaving." Arthur could not speak. The most feared negotiator in England was completely and utterly paralyzed. No one defended him. He was the monster. He was the shield. People feared him, obeyed him, or hated him, but no one had ever stood in the line of fire for him. He offered her his arm, his hand trembling imperceptibly. Clara looped her arm through his, and together they walked out of the silent drawing room, leaving Lord Whitmore humiliated and entirely destroyed. The carriage ride back to Kincaid Manor was steeped in a thick, electric tension. The rain had begun to fall, drumming a frantic rhythm against the roof. Inside the dark cabin, the only light came from the passing street lamps, casting brief, golden flashes across Clara's face. Arthur sat across from her. He hadn't said a word since they left the party. He just stared at her. Clara looked out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You are quiet, Arthur. Are you angry that I spoke out of turn?" Arthur let out a harsh, breathless sound that was half laugh, half groan. He closed the distance between them in a single, fluid movement, leaving his seat and dropping onto the bench right beside her. Clara gasped softly as his large hands gently framed her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. In the dim light, his gray eyes were entirely stripped of their ice. They were wild, raw, and blazing with a desperate kind of reverence. "Angry?" he whispered, his voice incredibly rough. "Clara, no one has ever done that for me. No one." "He was insulting my husband," she replied softly, her breath hitching as his thumb stroked her lower lip. "I will not allow anyone to speak of you that way." Arthur closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. He was drowning. The careful, isolated life he had built was completely gone, washed away by the fierce, protective light of a woman he had tried to buy. He realized, with a terrifying certainty, that he didn't just admire her. He worshipped her, and if he wasn't very careful, this love would break him completely. The storm that broke over Kincaid Manor just past midnight was merciless. Wind howled violently against the stone walls, and rain lashed the glass windows like handfuls of gravel. Arthur paced the length of his dark bedchamber. He had not even attempted to sleep. He was still wearing his trousers and a loose linen shirt, the memory of Clara's touch in the carriage burning fiercely against his skin. She had defended him. She had looked at the monster of London and seen a man worth protecting. The revelation was completely undoing him. A massive, deafening crack of thunder shook the heavy floorboards beneath his feet. Arthur stopped pacing. Lily, the child, was absolutely terrified of storms. Her previous nanny used to lock the nursery door and let the girl cry herself to exhaustion. Arthur's chest tightened. He grabbed his heavy, fur-lined wool coat from the back of a chair and strode out into the dark corridor. He moved quickly, expecting to find the new housemaids desperately trying to calm a hysterical child. But as he pushed the heavy oak door of the nursery open, he found no servants. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting long, jagged shadows. Clara was sitting on the floor in the far corner, wedged between the heavy wardrobe and the wall. She wore a simple white cotton nightdress, her golden hair falling over her shoulder in a loose, messy braid. She had her knees pulled up, and little Lily was tucked securely against her chest, trembling violently with every boom of thunder. "It is only the sky clearing its throat, my brave knight," Clara whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of Lily's dark hair. "The dragons are just having a very loud argument." Arthur stood frozen in the doorway. Clara looked so fragile in the dim light, shivering slightly against the drafty stone wall, yet she was pouring every ounce of her warmth into the frightened child. Another violent crack of thunder echoed. Lily let out a sharp, terrified whimper, burying her face into Clara's neck. Arthur didn't call for the housekeeper. He didn't order Clara back to her bed. He crossed the nursery with quiet, measured steps. Clara looked up, her blue eyes widening in surprise as the imposing Duke stopped right in front of them. "Arthur," she breathed softly, "I did not mean to wake you." "The storm." She didn't get to finish her sentence. Arthur shrugged off his heavy, fur-lined coat. Without a single word, the most feared man in the British Empire lowered his tall, powerful frame onto the cold hardwood floor. He sat down right beside Clara, his thigh pressing firmly against hers. Before she could question him, Arthur draped his massive coat over her shoulders, pulling it around both Clara and the child. The heavy wool instantly trapped the heat, carrying the rich, comforting scent of sandalwood and rain. Clara's breath hitched. She stared at him, completely stunned. Arthur shifted closer, wrapping one strong arm around Clara's shoulders. He pulled her slightly sideways so that her head rested against his chest. He was acting as a human shield, placing his own body between his family and the raging storm. "Arthur," Clara whispered, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming tenderness of his action. "You will freeze." "I am perfectly fine, Clara," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her ear. Lily peeked out from under the heavy fur collar. She looked up at her terrifying uncle, her small eyes wide with apprehension. Arthur looked down at the little girl. He lifted his free hand and, with surprising gentleness, smoothed a damp curl away from Lily's forehead. "I will not let the storm touch you," Arthur promised the child. But as he spoke the words, his gray eyes shifted back to Clara, locking onto hers in the dark. The fierce, unguarded devotion in his gaze made Clara's heart stop. He wasn't just talking to Lily. He was making a vow to her. Clara slowly relaxed, letting her full weight rest against Arthur's side. The cold stone of the manor seemed to vanish. Beneath the heavy coat, surrounded by his strength and his warmth, she felt safer than she had ever felt in her entire life. They sat together on the hard floor as the storm raged outside. Arthur did not move, did not complain, and did not let go. He stood guard through the night, proving to Clara that the man who had bought her with gold was truly ready to pay the price with his soul. The morning sun washed the corridors of Kincaid Manor in a pale, fragile light. Arthur sat behind the massive mahogany desk in his study, staring blankly at the wall. His heavy wool coat was draped over a chair, still carrying the faint, sweet scent of jasmine. He was terrified. Arthur Blackwood did not feel fear. He caused it. But as he had watched Clara sleep against his chest on the hard nursery floor, he had realized a devastating truth. If she asked him to burn his shipping empire to the ground, he would strike the match. He had lost his edge. The ruthless, untouchable Duke of Kincaid was entirely at the mercy of a woman with golden hair and a fierce, compassionate heart. Panic clawed at his chest. He needed control. He needed to rebuild the walls before she realized how much power she held over him. He had to remind them both of the original arrangement. It was a transaction, nothing more. A soft knock broke the silence. "Enter," Arthur said. He forced his voice to drop to its usual flat, commanding drawl. The heavy oak doors opened, and Clara stepped inside. She looked radiant. She wore a simple yellow morning dress, and there was a soft, hesitant smile on her lips. It was a smile meant for the man who had sat on the floor and shielded her from the storm. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, but he locked his jaw and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Clara." Her smile faltered slightly at his freezing tone, but she walked forward and took the seat. "Good morning, Arthur. Are you feeling well? You were awake all night." "I am perfectly fine," he replied sharply. He did not look into her beautiful blue eyes. Instead, he opened a drawer, pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, and slid it across the polished wood toward her. Clara looked at the envelope, then back at his cold, unreadable face. "What is this?" "An adjustment to our arrangement," Arthur said evenly, leaning back in his leather chair. "I have observed your interactions with Lily over the past few weeks, and particularly your dedication during the storm last night." Clara's brow furrowed. She was frightened. She needed comfort. "And you provided it," Arthur interrupted smoothly, flawlessly. "You are exceeding the expectations of our contract. Therefore, it is only fair that you are compensated for your exceptional service. In that envelope is a bank draft. A substantial allowance for you to purchase new gowns, jewelry, or whatever it is women of the temps desire." Silence fell over the room. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet before a glass shatters. Clara stared at the white envelope. The warmth completely vanished from her face, replaced by a pale, crushing realization. She slowly lifted her gaze to his. The fierce, tender connection they had shared in the dark nursery was gone. He was looking at her the exact same way he had looked at her father 3 months ago. Like a ledger entry. "Compensated," Clara repeated. Her voice was a fragile whisper that cut Arthur deeper than a knife. "For my service." Arthur gripped the armrests of his chair to keep his hands from shaking. "It is a standard practice, Clara. You have earned it." Clara stood up. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply left the envelope sitting on the desk. "You bought my hand to settle a debt, Your Grace," she said, her voice turning as cold and distant as his. "I am fulfilling my duty as your wife and as Lily's aunt, because it is right, not because I expect a wage. Keep your gold. It seems to be the only thing that actually keeps you warm." She turned around and walked out of the study, pulling the heavy doors shut behind her with a quiet, definitive click. Arthur sat in the deafening silence. He had done exactly what he set out to do. He had rebuilt the wall. He had re-established the transaction. He was safe. He looked at the untouched envelope on his desk. He reached out and picked it up. His hands were trembling violently. He suddenly felt sicker and colder than he had ever felt in his life. He had protected himself, but in doing so, he had just broken the only beautiful thing he had ever possessed. 3 days passed. 3 days of absolute, suffocating silence. Kincaid Manor had returned to the exact state Arthur had originally demanded. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the morning sun. The rigid schedules were strictly followed. Clara did not run on the south lawn. She did not laugh in the corridors. She moved through the grand, drafty halls like a beautiful, silent ghost. Arthur sat at the head of the long dining table, his food turning cold on the exquisite silver plate. Clara sat at his right, just as she had at the Harrington dinner, but the fierce, radiant woman who had defended him to the baton was completely gone. She was perfectly polite. She answered his questions with short, agreeable sentences. She was exactly the compliant, invisible wife he had asked for in his study 3 months ago. It was the most excruciating torture Arthur had ever endured. "Are the new tutors suitable for Lily?" Arthur asked, the sound of his own voice grating in the painfully quiet room. "They are perfectly adequate, Your Grace," Clara replied softly. She did not look up from her teacup. Her eyes were completely blank. "Your Grace." She hadn't called him Arthur since the night of the storm. Every time she used his formal title, it felt like a heavy iron blade twisting in his ribs. He watched her place her napkin on the table, stand up, and excuse herself with a flawless, emotionless curtsy. She walked out of the room without looking back. Arthur didn't stop her. He just sat in the terrible quiet, his hands clenched into tight fists resting on the white linen tablecloth. Later that afternoon, Arthur stood alone in his study. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock echoed like a hammer against his skull. He stared at the massive iron safe built into the stone wall. It held deeds to global shipping fleets, tens of thousands of pounds in gold, and the very contract that had purchased Clara's hand. He possessed more wealth than half the lords in England combined. He reached out and rested his bare palm against the freezing iron door. It meant absolutely nothing. It was all utterly, laughably worthless. He could buy an armada of ships, but he couldn't buy the way Clara's eyes lit up when she smiled. He could purchase any estate in the country, but he couldn't buy the fierce, protective warmth she had wrapped around him in the carriage. He had tried to use his gold to protect himself from his own vulnerability. He had used his wallet as a shield because he was too terrified to use his heart. And in return, he had bought his own private hell. A small, hesitant knock interrupted his dark thoughts. The heavy door pushed open just a few inches, and Lily peeked inside. "Uncle Arthur?" the little girl asked timidly. Arthur turned away from the iron safe. He immediately dropped to one knee on the Persian rug so he wouldn't tower over her. "What is it, Lily?" Lily stepped into the room, hugging her worn rag doll tightly against her chest. Her big eyes were filled with deep worry. "Is Aunt Clara going away?" "She doesn't tell stories about the dragons anymore. She just sits in the greenhouse and looks at the dirt." Arthur felt a crushing weight press down on his lungs, making it difficult to breathe. The little girl wasn't just asking a question. She was holding a mirror up to his soul. He was the dragon. He was the monster stealing the light from the only two people in the world who mattered to him. "No, Lily," Arthur said, his voice thick with a raw, desperate emotion he had denied for a decade. He reached out and gently squeezed the child's small shoulder. "She is not going anywhere. I am going to fix it." "How?" Lily whispered. Arthur stood up, his jaw set with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "By surrendering." He didn't wait for his butler. He didn't grab his coat or check his ledgers. Arthur Blackwood walked straight out of his study, leaving the heavy oak door wide open to the empty gold. For the first time in his entirely calculated life, the Duke of Kincaid was marching into battle, completely unarmed, prepared to lose his pride, his walls, and his mind, just to win back his wife's soul. The air inside the glass greenhouse was thick and warm, smelling of damp earth, crushed leaves, and blooming orchids. Clara stood at the far end of the narrow aisle. She held a small silver watering can, but she wasn't moving. She was simply staring at a row of fragile white roses, looking completely lost. The heavy iron hinges of the greenhouse door groaned open. Clara didn't turn around. She assumed it was the head gardener coming to tend the soil. She kept her eyes fixed on the white petals, trying to swallow the tight ache in her throat. "I do not want the money, Clara." The deep, rough voice sent a shockwave straight down her spine. Clara gasped, the silver watering can slipping from her fingers and clattering against the stone floor. She spun around. Arthur stood at the edge of the aisle. He looked entirely different. The immaculate, terrifying Duke of Kincaid was gone. His dark jacket was unbuttoned, his silk cravat was carelessly loosened, and his dark hair fell slightly across his forehead. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. The cold winter ice was completely shattered. He looked frantic. He looked desperate. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, her heart giving a painful flutter. She took a step back, instinctively guarding herself. "If you have come to dictate a new schedule—" "There are no schedules," Arthur interrupted, his voice cracking. He closed the distance between them with rapid, heavy strides, stopping just inches away from her. He didn't try to intimidate her. He looked down at her with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "There is no contract. There is no arrangement. I am tearing it all up." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "I do not understand." "I was terrified, Clara," Arthur breathed, his large hands hovering in the air between them, desperate to touch her, but terrified she would pull away. "During the storm, when I held you in the nursery, I realized that you held my entire life in your hands. You walked into this dark, freezing house, and you brought the sun with you. You defended me to the tone. You loved a frightened little girl. You looked at a monster and smiled." Clara's vision blurred with sudden, hot tears. "Arthur, I have spent 10 years building walls of gold and iron to keep the world out," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "And you dismantled them in a month. I offered you that envelope because I was a coward. I tried to reduce you to a transaction again because I was terrified of how much I loved you. I thought if I pushed you away, it wouldn't destroy me when you eventually realized I have no heart left to give you." A single tear slipped down Clara's cheek. Arthur's breath hitched. And then, the most feared negotiator in the British Empire did the unthinkable. And he sank to the damp stone floor. Arthur Blackwood dropped to his knees right in front of her. He reached out, his trembling hands gently grasping her waist. He looked up at her, completely surrendering his pride, his power, and his heavily guarded soul. "I bought a bride to settle a debt," Arthur whispered, gazing up into her tear-filled blue eyes. "But I am the one who belongs to you. You own every breath in my lungs. You own my name, my fortune, and my life. Please, Clara, forgive my foolishness. Do not go back to being a ghost. Yell at me, throw the ledger at my head, but please, come back to me." Clara let out a choked sob. She didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees on the stone floor right in front of him, her hands flying up to frame his face. She wiped a stray tear from his sharp cheekbone with her thumb. "You have a heart, Arthur," Clara whispered fiercely, a radiant, blinding smile breaking through her tears. "I have held it. I have felt it beat for Lily, and I have felt it beat for me." Arthur let out a ragged groan. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his hands in her golden hair, and finally crashed his lips down onto hers. The kiss was a breathtaking collision. It held years of his desperate isolation and all of her fierce, overflowing warmth. It wasn't polite or calculated. It was messy, breathless, and deeply reverent. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as he held her, tasting the salt of tears and the absolute certainty of forever. When Arthur finally pulled back to breathe, he rested his forehead against hers. He kept his eyes closed, holding her against his violently beating heart, knowing he had finally paid the highest price, and the love he won in return was worth every single piece of his surrendered soul. Thank you for joining us on Clara and Arthur's journey. If this story warmed your heart, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel for more beautiful, wholesome historical romances. Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below. To listen to another wonderful love story, click the video on your screen now. Until next time,